you so much for being here tonight, this evening. So today is Monday, November the 7th. I hope that everyone that is watching this has either gone out to early vote or will vote tomorrow and participate in our democracy. With that, I'm calling the Charlotte City Council meeting for November the 7th to order. And this meeting is the time that we actually have reports from the various committees of the City Council after having an idea about what their conversations have been, particularly as it relates to some of the planning that we're doing long-term and short-term. And so are there any questions? Is everybody ready to be prepared for this evening? All right. Why don't we start with introductions with our city clerk, and we'll go around the room, and then we'll proceed to the next step on our agenda.
Billy Tons, Deputy City Clerk.
Good evening, Dimple Ajmera at large.
Good evening. I am Marjorie Molina. I represent East Charlotte, District 5.
Good evening, James Mitchell at large.
Good evening, Renee Johnson, District 4.
Braxton Winston at large and serving as Mayor Pro Tem.
Vi Lyle serving as mayor.
Malcolm Graham, District 2.
Ed Drakes, District 7.
Up on in there, buddy.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Tarek Bakari, District 6.
Good evening. Dante Anderson, District 1.
Good evening. My name is Victoria Watlington, and I'm your Charlotte City Council member representing District 3.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
All right, thank you, everyone. I thought we would start off with welcoming Mr. Graham back, who has had some surgery, and have him kick us off with his committee. And the members are I want to recognize Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and it's good to be back and back to work on behalf of the citizens of District 2 in the city. The Jobs and Economic Development Committee met today. My Vice Chairman is Mr. Drakes, Councilmember Ajmera, Molino, and Wallington. We welcome the Mayor Pro Tem as well to our meeting. Our agenda was pretty straightforward. We had 3 items, a discussion of the Housing and Job Summit, the Arts and Culture Plan, as well as the International Business Strategy. A lot of discussion in reference to the upcoming Housing and Job Summit plan. Obviously, the Economic Development Committee plays an important role in that in reference to the job aspect of that, workforce development. A couple of things that came out of it, and Ms. Dotson, our Assistant City Manager, was there, got great notes, as well as a lot of preparation already from the department in terms of the summit. But just some takeaways that the committee talked about was one, which I think is really important, decisions in action driven by policy. That's what we really want to come out after the summit is over. We want to make sure that we have all the city-owned tools on display as relates to workforce development. We want to also make sure that we match opportunities with job seekers, even working with some of our local agencies to do a pop-up job expo if possible. Workforce development jobs of the immediate here, but also taking a look at jobs that may be on the horizon, i.e. the HM Innovation District. They're doing a great job in terms of already identifying and attracting international companies coming to Charlotte that will be looking for workforce within the next 60, 90 days, making sure that we match those opportunities with the job seekers and those individuals in our communities who are actually helping us produce the work. A focus on construction-related jobs and working with our General Contractors Association, identifying those trades. Also be able to identify boundaries to employment, reentry, retooling, child care, working with our unions to identify tradesmen, iron workers, painters, carpenters, those things that bring people to work. So the discussion was very robust. I think Ms. Dotson took back a lot of good information. Again, the staff has already started doing much of the work. We just kind of dotted i's and crossed t's in terms of some of the things that we're doing. Secondly, we talked about the international business strategy, and this is something that the committee will be really diving head on first. There was a recent article a couple of months ago that named the 100 best cities in the world. Charlotte came in at 99. That means we're not only the 15th largest city in the country, but we're internationally known, and that our approach should be to try to retain, recruit international companies. We have an office of one, Mr. Manager, and so we probably need to take a look at that. We also need to take a look at what the Alliance is doing, which has traditionally done a lot of our international recruiting on behalf of the city. They're making some realignments there. And so what we did today was just really kind of talk about where do we want to go, how do we want to get there, what tools that we need to utilize to do that. We talked about our international portfolio locally, a lot of touch points with our subcommittee. Councilmember Dregs, former councilmember from District Phipps, did a lot of work with the International Cabinet, World Affairs Council. And so we just need to kind of change the fuel in the car in reference to our international strategy from just kind of just doing it because we're supposed to do it, to be really a lot more intentional about doing it with measurable results along the way. And then lastly, we talked about the arts and culture update. Assistant Manager Dotson, Priya from the Arts and Culture Office did an excellent job in terms of painting the picture in terms of where we are today, and the work that they're doing in terms of outreaching to the community, making sure that we are engaging and getting the information back forward. One of the things that we need to do, and Councilmember Dregs and I, as well as the Mayor Pro Tem, we're a little behind based on might not being available, but now that I'm back in the saddle, to just really kind of reach out to the council members just to make sure that we don't give the staff any heartburn, right, when we land this plane in reference to the plan itself, that we provide the type of direction now. They are certainly significant ways down the road in terms of preparing the plan. I think the consultants, I think the staff, I think Priya is doing a good job in terms of what they were asked to do, and we just need to make sure that the council affirms that. And I think from where we are today, I think we're moving in the right direction. So all in all, I thought our committee was straightforward, to the point, a lot of good information, a lot of, we had some guests by the invitation of Councilmember Winston from Smart Start. They were there, and others, and so we just felt that we had a really good meeting and good way to start the month.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Graham. You said at the beginning on the Housing and Jobs Summit that you discussed decisions and actions driven by policy. Were there any specifics that were addressed in this area, and did you talk about how that summit might look or would work best for the ideas that you have?
Well, one thing that Councilmember Dregs talked about, and it's just this whole apprenticeship concept, right, where that we identify opportunities, we compensate people who are going through this opportunity while they're attending classes, while they're getting the type of training necessary, apprenticeship necessary to be successful. And that's something I think we need to take a look at as a possible outcome of it. Certainly, through the last year and a half, we made a lot of investment with stakeholders in the community via our COVID funds. And so we have a lot of Charlotte Works and other organizations already doing some of the critical work that's necessary to be successful. And so just making sure that we have the right partners at the table with us at the summit, that we're not reinventing the wheels, but also more importantly, really kind of, dot I's, cross T's, and be very intentional that when we leave the summit that we're just not doing a whole lot of talking. And even if it's just 1 or 2, 3 bullet points that we say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to invest dollars to make sure we get there, and this is how we're going to invest staff time to ensure that we kind of get these results.
One of the questions that I have, and I think this is for each of the committees, that I think when we think about the Housing and Jobs Summit, one of the questions I have, do you see it as a council action meeting where you actually talk about what the policies would be, the decisions and the actions that you would take, or do you see it as something that you'd like to hear from community folks? I'm trying to, I would like to have each committee reflect on what is the real purpose. Is it to have the council decide council policy, or is it to have more engagement, to have council, or the community help council be more informed? And so I just wonder about which direction we're leaning towards, because we've talked about this as a part of our initiatives around housing and jobs for a number of years. And I think that one of the questions that we have is whether or not, excuse me, I thought this was off. Where were we trying to go? Where did you think your committee wanted to land? Is it more that the council agrees on a direction, or is it that you have another idea in mind?
I think it's a combination of both, right? I think it's one, I think I heard loud and clear, and any of my committee members, please feel free to jump in as well, is that they want action-driven. We just don't want to be talking to each other and then leave empty-handed. That we really want to leave that summit after 2 days saying, here's some policy direction to get us to a successful conclusion. The wraparound between housing, jobs, and transportation, how they get to the jobs, right? And then also, I think it's the way of really interfacing with the community in a way that allows them to take advantage of the resources that we already have on the ground. And we have a number of resources, housing resources, transportation resources, and workforce development that's already on the floor, prepared for people to utilize. So if we can educate and inform them how to access the services that we already have, i.e., a pop-up job fair and connecting opportunities for job seekers, that can be part of it. But also, I think the main focus from my perspective is that it's policy-driven, right? That we really look at the policies that are in front of us that needs to be sharpened or need to be rethought, or retooled to ensure that, as we move into the next year, 2023, that we have a clear idea of where we want to go. So I think it could be a combination of both, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. And Madam Mayor, I think the question you asked, I think that's what I'm going to say we need to get out of tonight, because I attended all 4 committee meetings, and I don't think we have a clear understanding, and we should have a clear understanding by the end of tonight. I think the question, if it wasn't asked in every committee, it was referenced in every committee. But the question is, what is the audience? Who is the audience for this Housing and Justice Summit? And who do we want to participate in the summit, and how do we want them to participate? I'll speak for myself. I was under the assumption the reason why we're having this Housing and Jobs Summit was that's the combination where we look at economic mobility, put those two together. Council members have said that is the kind of policy lens that we should be operating from. We shouldn't just be operating from looking at affordable housing or jobs by itself or transportation by itself, but how do we kind of get there? But I don't know if that's necessarily where we're all at right now. We talked a lot about in every committee about the barriers that people face and how we can look at policy or participate in this summit to better understand those barriers. And some committees talked about, again, creating policies to address those barriers. Others were more focused on information gathering. So I think we need to help each other out here. to answer those specific questions. I don't think it was a clear directive came out of any particular committee today in regards to that.
Okay. Ms. Molina?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I actually, I agree with you, Mayor Pro Tem. I think, I was in 2 of those 4 meetings. And I think everyone has some ideas, and this is just my vision, the way I saw it when we said we were going to have a jobs and housing summit. I won't say that what we have done has not worked totally. I think we have such a large scope of opportunity that there's no way we're going to resolve all of our issues at once. I think I remember Chairwoman Watlington speaking specifically to having like some pre-material for deliverables so that there are items that we're attuned to before we actually take part in the summit so that we can actually develop some policy-related outcomes. I know that for sure. I don't know whether that involves having other people from our communities involved or other community stakeholders involved, but I do see this being something, in my opinion personally, something where we got a lot of brain power in this room. And we have an amazing amount of resources at our disposal in our city. And I think my opinion is that we need to see what we're capable of first. When I think brainstorming from a policy or a project perspective, I think ideas and opportunities. I'm finding out who my key stakeholders are. I'm developing a baseline. I'm finding out what my key milestones are. I'm looking at my project timeline, my project budget, and I'm deciding who those people are along that baseline who can help me achieve my objective. Now, we have different levels of AMI. We have different levels of, resources for people who need different things, people who need jobs, people who need to upskill for a job where they can afford to live in their house. I mean, we just got all of these needs among 950,000 people, and we have a $3.2 billion finite budget opportunity to do so. So I think we just have to be as strategic as possible to, make sure that we achieve an objective with a set outcome that is going to deliver results to our community members.
Thank you. I really think it's important because we have had the history of our 20 years of an affordable housing trust fund, and it's been extremely successful in the idea of building trust. When people didn't believe that we would build anything, we did. And now we have reached a place where we have an opportunity that as people go out and vote, we hope that they'll support the bonds, and we have another $50 million to deal with that. And my understanding, and I think both you and the Mayor Pro Tem, Ms. Molina, said this, is that we were really trying to figure out how do we move towards upward mobility versus new construction or construction. Now, I think that the manager and his team have been thinking through this probably a little bit longer, but the pre-reads are going to be important because all of us need to have a base level of understanding of what we've done in the past, but also what questions do we have for going to the future. So I'm going to ask the manager to talk a little bit about what the staff work that's being done and how we tie together these ideas, not just of housing, but jobs, housing, and mobility.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor, and members of council. So I guess I'll start off with a quote from Councilmember Graham, and that is to make sure that you're on the plane when it takes off and not getting on the plane as it lands. I say that because staff started working on this during the last council that was seated. And the concept was, and many of you either because you were on the council or you were watching this, it was a discussion about let's make sure the council chooses how they would like to deploy these funds in the future. And it would have to be not just about housing, it would be about housing and jobs and mobility, and he tied it all together with upward mobility. So we thought that we were following the instructions that we received from council, and we took off, okay? So we worked with, and Julia, I think I got this right, 100 resilient cities, and we were trying to have Charlotte as the example for the country, where a community was coming together to talk about a very difficult issue. So I will apologize to Seattle and San Francisco, but we didn't want to become the next Seattle or San Francisco because we are bursting at the seams in terms of growth. So we started off with a question, and the question was, or the guiding question was, how can we continue to attract, retain, and develop jobs for individuals with a variety of skill levels while providing opportunities for affordable housing and pathways to home ownership? And we started to, I guess, whiteboard that with some of our partners from across the country, and they got excited about it. We also started to send out invitations to county commissioners, to some of our folks in the workforce development teams, the housing partnership scene. And on October the 10th, we were going to present this to you as a framework of moving forward with making sure that we had captured much of what we thought that you wanted. And I think there was a committee head meeting that day and said, let's put the brakes on. Let's let council have an opportunity to discuss this. So I think where we were headed is similar to many of the things that we were hearing today, where we were monitoring. Part of that would be, again, 2 days. Part of that would be your priority setting, reaffirming that. And it's not, we have had fall, we don't call them retreats, we call them fall planning sessions, where we've talked about the budget outlook. So we have talked about where we thought we ended FY '22, where we think we're heading in FY '23, and also a little glimpse into FY '24. We would talk about ARPA funds, and out of that, for us, one of the big takeaways would be, are there some areas that are no longer priorities for this council, or are there new priorities for this council as it relates to jobs, upward mobility, mobility in general, and housing? So again, we thought, or at least I thought on the 10th, we would test that with you. Where I think I failed is that typically when we do something like that, we would go to the budget committee and we'd have an agenda and that committee would test it to see. And so, that's where we are. So we welcome the input tonight. One takeaway would be, because there are ARPA funds out there, because we'd love to have a discussion with you about where we think we ended the last fiscal year and where we think the outlook is, this would be very helpful for us. So getting a couple of dates and reaffirming that you want this to be more than just a council discussion, unless you want it to just be a council discussion, but a council/community discussion, things of that nature. There are people in the community that really want to be a part of this.
So let me see if I can say this back, Mr. Jones. What you have outlined is that the concept was to have a very open discussion with people that were very interested in the topics, but the topics would include how we would actually look at priorities for the city, which we've always voted on and had agreement when we went to a fall planning session. But we also need to look at our budget outlook and the ARPA funding. And, as you talked about, developers and the county, and I think about how are we going to deal with the Housing Justice Coalition 31 topics and programs that they recommended and brought to us. We at some point have to really invest some time to get to do this, and it's probably not a Monday night kind of discussion. So what you're saying is 2 days, and it would be good to have an idea of are we trying to do it before the end of the year? Or is it something at the beginning of the year? How do we want to do this? And so I think these are some of the questions that we can discuss today.
I had one more thing.
Yes, please.
And one thing that actually came up today, one concept is to really do a case study where everybody can focus on that case study. We use Pepper Tree as an example. What could we have done better with Pepper Tree? I think Councilmember Bakari actually brought this up today. So it is that. It is because I guess back in May, we were even talking about should the city focus more on workforce housing along the light rail lines? And could there be a partnership with the county with the focus more so on, let's say, 30% and below. And so I'm not trying to solve tonight, but just saying there's been a lot of good discussions about how we can really partner with the different groups in the Mecklenburg County to come out with something so that we aren't some of those cities that growth has really strangled them.
Well, I also think that one of the things that as we look, and I'm listing out community and development and all of that, I think about the people that are being trained and all of those partners that we have. Talking to Dr. Dietermeyer, she says, she can do a lot of work, but she can't, provide people housing, or she can't provide them with transportation and all of the things that they need so that they can come, be ready to learn and be ready to do something or retrain and upfit and all of those things. So I saw Ms. Ashmira and then Mr. Driggs, and is there anyone that I missed over here? Ms. Johnson and Mr. Graham. So I feel like this is something that we can pull out things from your meetings. Feel free to contribute whatever that you think helps us at the end of the evening to be able to say, this is what we think this meeting ought to cover, if you agree with what the manager has said, or add something or take something away. So, Ms. Ajmira?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I agree with you, Mr. Jones, 100%. We need to do a case study. And I think that's something Ms. Anderson raised at our committee meeting, where we are focused on outcomes, right? And some of my colleagues on the committee also mentioned that we are focused on the outcomes as we have this summit. So I think case study will help us focus on the outcomes by taking one case study at a time. But I also want to make sure that as we look at some of the strategies, we are also looking at budget implications for each one of them, right? Because it could work really well on just tackling one issue, but if it completely throws off our budget, that means we have to raise property taxes that ultimately increases the displacement. We got to factor that in. So I think having, at the end of the day, rubber meets the road at the budget level. So budget implications would be a key towards all of that, unless the funding comes from another source, right? Whether it's ARPA or, I know you mentioned we can look at ARPA-specific funds like housing and jobs. Are those specifically we have to use for housing, or is it just that's how we have allocated?
Oh, that's a great question. Again, recommendations from the staff to a previous council. This council could say, with all the remaining ARPA funds, we want to go into a different direction.
This is why we gotta have longer terms. This is, I'm sorry, I'm not.
Okay, so it's not that we have this much amount of funds left that has to go towards either or this. It has to go towards housing. It could be used towards workforce development, for an example, right?
I believe that the last earmark that the council has not moved on, we had $1.5 million associated with arts and culture in the corridors. We have some funds related to a food co-op, and we may have some funds that are maybe $1 million left that's, let's say, earmarked. But when we talk about the 39 million, when we talk about the 16 million for economic workforce development, so I'm not going to make eye contact with Tracy or Renee. Clearly, we would like for them to stay in those buckets because that's what we've been moving towards. But again, you may come out of the summit and say that based on what's happened in this economy over the last 6 months, maybe we need to redouble our efforts somewhere else.
Right, and I think that's an important conversation we need to have as the council, and also keeping economic conditions. We gotta have that focus, as I read report after report from economists that says we will see some sort of recession within the next year. And I know the state is planning towards that, increasing our reserve, right? What is it that local level we need to do, and so that we are not passing that burden on to our residents, especially our elderly residents who live on a fixed income, as we are going in property reassessment year next year. So that's just one. And then I remember Mr. Mitchell had raised specifically having some sort of stakeholders list, right? To ensure that all the folks that needs to be in the room are being invited and are part of the discussion. And I know Mr. Mitchell have had some feedback on that. And then also the committee discussed having a clear expectations, that I think we are discussing that right now. And then we need to just figure out the timeline. I know you said either before the holidays or after the holidays. I think earlier we do it, the better it is, so that we can use some of these ARPA funds that we have, because currently it's just sitting there. But that's just, I really think we need to come up with the strategy sooner rather than later. And I know Mr. Bukhari raised this or pointed this out about workforce development needs to be sort of like a highlight. We got to make sure there is a focus on workforce development. I'll let Mr. Bukhari speak on that, but he certainly made sure that we continue to keep that focus on that. And intergovernmental, I don't know if some of the strategy or some of the focus areas like housing and jobs, and if you're discussing, for an example, a potential solution, if we need to add that to our intergovernmental agenda. As we are preparing for that in December. So council will see our intergovernmental agenda in January. So that's why it's important to have this conversation before the holidays so that we are preparing, because we'll be in Raleigh in January. So we got to finalize our agenda as to what will be in our federal agenda and our state agenda. But some of this might just be working with the county or the CMS. So we got to prepare sort of a parking lot of here are all the things we need to lobby for with our county or our state or our CMS. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think the biggest risk with this is that 3 months after our summit, nobody remembers what happened. So my biggest concern is that we have the goal of adoption, of action. There's a lot of philosophical talk. I think actually we're in broad agreement about what a lot of our goals are. But we're in a pretty exotic situation right now. I mean, we've seen that, for example, 11 of our Housing Trust Fund projects can't be funded at the originally intended level, which presents a very basic question about where is the best opportunity to invest to further our goals on housing. What models should we be looking at? Should we be looking at ownership models, NOAA models? I know there's a diversity of opinion in this group, but I hope we can all agree that whenever we meet, our highest priority is to respond to current circumstances. This recession outlook, for example, what does that mean? Will inflation continue? So are things only going to get worse in terms of our ability to fund housing, or can we expect, if we just took some time off? But let's have some decisions that are being made at this thing. And for that purpose, I think there's a certain amount of processing what's being said today and what has come out of the committees toward a structure for the meeting. Personally, I don't know whether it's about hearing from everybody so much as taking what we already know. I mean, I'm interested, obviously, in input. This is me, but I'm interested in input. But again, I've been to so many meetings over the years, and we have a parade of either interest groups, stakeholders, or we have subject matter experts. And then you go away and you ask yourself, so, okay, now what? And there needs to be a now what, I think, that comes out of this session. And I think there are some areas that we can look at. We can look at things like the NOAA model that we're already aware of. We can look at ownership models and kind of compute the economics under current conditions of trying to do more of that, because that's something that is still available to us. I expect we'll want to continue to pursue 9% LIHTC deals if we can get them, because the return on that investment is still good. So that would really just be my main ask, is that a lot of what we're talking about is aimed at an action item on the agenda for the summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Jones, for the clarification. That was one of the questions that I had. Who was the audience? It was a little unclear. So this sounds like our strategic planning session or strategy session. Would you say that there's a difference?
I would say the difference is you'll start off broadly with the priorities, but if we stick with what this summit is about, you would be more so laser focused on how can you pull together jobs, housing, and mobility. And that would be, so anything outside of that would be something that maybe is for a different day discussion. So how can you pull those three together, much like you did in some of the committee discussions today, so that there could be more of a focus on those three? So in other words, if we were doing something related to CAMP, it may be for another discussion.
Okay, so this is a just focused strategic session. We also talked about last week taking a step back and really taking a look at our zoning and infrastructure and that whole process. We talked about that. This is separate and we can talk about that. But I know that we were saying we wanted to have that in December as well. So if we're talking about a focused meeting on infrastructure and then this meeting as well, I don't know how we can tie in those two, and that may be for the mayor. I'm not sure.
Well, I would like to say that we can do two things well, and that I think the most important one is getting that budget outlook that would come in the original meeting that would allow us to understand what we would be able to do with infrastructure. The manager, for the years and time that he has been here, has always been very clear at looking at what the revenue projections are, what choices the council makes, and that often defines how much infrastructure we can accomplish if we do it the same way. If there are other ways to do it, we want to welcome those opportunities to discuss that as well. So most of the time, infrastructure is pretty solid around, sidewalks and stormwater and all of those things, but there are opportunities that we haven't looked at that need to come into the discussion, and I think that's why it would be a separate meeting, and I do believe that we ought to be able to do both of them.
Good. And when the council, I think, well, I know what my intent as the motion maker was, not just infrastructure. We don't want to get pinholed into just that word. We want to talk about the impacts of all of the zoning and growth in the area. So,
Right.
Thank you.
I think Mr. Graham, followed by Ms. Watlington.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. And I want to take your line. I think Councilmember Driggs and Ashmere kind of capture my thoughts in terms of what the manager laid out. I think that makes a lot of sense. That was our original starting point. I think it makes sense that we do hear the voice of community partners, many of which we've funded over the last year and a half with some of these ARCO dollars to do some of this work, right? And I think there was even some discussion about around this table in reference to outcomes and performance, how they utilize the dollars. So I think that gives them an opportunity to share with us how those dollars were spent and if they had more, what would they do with it? And lastly, again, I just echo what Councilmember Drake said in terms of it's just when this thing is over, that we are moving into a certain direction. For an example, we celebrated the anniversary of the Housing Trust Fund, 20 years. I mean, hopefully the voters tomorrow will grant us another $50 million. I mean, do we continue to do the same thing we've done for the last 20 years? Do we do something different? we ask ourselves the question after tomorrow, hopefully, and it passes, is $50 million enough in terms of the needs that we have in this community? And if the question is, it's not, then we talk with the manager about what is our bond capability? And if we did have hypothetically $125 million that were passed in the future, how will we spend it, right? I mean, and that's where we get the input from the community and community partners in reference to a strategic direction. So I like the way you framed it up front. I agree with you for sure that we want to leave this summit focus to deliver an outcome. And yes, I think Councilmember Ashmere basically kind of summed up a lot of my thoughts. Thank you.
Ms. Watlington?
Thank you. For me, we're talking about 2 days. Personally, I don't want to sit and talk about one big overarching strategic thing. I think we've had that conversation. Think about when we're talking about the public policy process, we're past the agenda setting piece. We need to be looking and deciding and prioritizing policies. And so in my opinion, the best use of our time during this summit is to really be looking at policies. I don't care if we had our partners send in pitch competitions. Send me a document that tells me what you would do with more funding. I feel like our financial partners do that every year. I want to hear from Pew. I want to hear from Brookings. I want to hear from UNC Charlotte. What policies are working across the country and how could that happen here? If we're not talking about policy, and to Mr. Driggs' point, adoption of something actionable, I think we've wasted 2 days. A lot of the information could be input, can come in the form of pre-read. We need to know before we walk in, what are we looking like dollars-wise? We need to know what the opportunity looks like. If it's $39 million from ARPA and that's it, okay. If it's some other buckets, then okay. That to me is input into a discussion. Part of what I shared in the previous committee meeting is that I really look at this as like a rapid improvement event. And so we've got this value stream, if you will, of people that are in our city and are moving through these processes, whether it's trying to get employed, whether it's trying to find housing, and there are, as Mayor Pro Tem mentioned in the meeting, there's barriers. And we know essentially what those barriers are. Our partners know. If you're just as involved, you know there's particular things that you're not going to be able to do because you've got to put down your previous history. Is it within our power or within our partners' powers to make adjustments there, and how does policy support that? Does that happen at a local level? Does it happen at the state level? Does it happen at the federal level? I would love to see us be able to leave out of this summit with a list of policies that address our 2040 goals and with some kind of mitigation plan, whether that's an authority column, yes, it's in our authority, or it sits somewhere else. How much does it cost roughly? And what is our plan going forward? Is it long-term? Is it midterm? Is it short-term? To me, that's the outcome of this, and that feeds then back into our planning process.
All right. Mayor Pro Tem?
I agree with the litany of comments that have been made. But I think Ms. Watlington really just kind of illustrated it pretty well, and I pretty much agree with it. Ms. Watlington also, we meet as committee chairs, and we've been trying to figure out how to make that time best utilized. And she made the suggestion of how do we month to month. We have this Comp 2040 plan that has 10 goals, that has over 360 suggested policies, right? So how do she suggested maybe we look at, okay, looking at one of those goals month to month. I'm sorry if I'm misquoting you. How do we look at those goals month to month and really decide what are those policy areas that we're going to hit on? I was pleased to see that several of the committees today utilized that structure and looked at what are the policy suggestions that live right now in the comprehensive 2040 plan, and as potential ideas of what we can discuss, what we'll work on at this summit. Because at the end of the day, again, as Ms. Watlington just pointed out, those should be actionable, right? We should be able to, if not on that day, put those policies in motion. We can give staff the real guidance to say, okay, well, you showed us 5 that we can work from. We're going to choose these 2. We need you to kind of get on the ball, and in the next 30, 60, 90 days, we want to make stuff work. Now, I will say that while we definitely shouldn't have total, presentations thrown at us for a day and a half, we are going into some different times. So I think we do need to have some feedback, right? We've been focusing on bringing more tech jobs. Tech is one of the industries that is really affected by the rise in interest rates. What is that going to do for the whole part of that economy? Are we going to all of a sudden have a slowdown, not just in hiring or an expansion, layoffs of certain of those workers? How do we deal with that? As we talked about in one committee, we're becoming the city of headquarters. Does that continue, over the next 5 years? Are there going to be relocations or not? We do need some sort of level setting, but I really do think we have a bevy of policy actions that we need to start working from. And this is sort of what we've been talking about as a council. We talked about the comprehensive plan, we talked about the UDO, but we've kind of, as a body, have stopped there. And we need to really, and we have some other issues, things like realignments, small community area planning processes, but what does that mean, right? And I think, how do we deploy those policy suggestions is there. So I would hope that we can operate from that paradigm, choose a few, and so we can get to work on them over the next year.
So I hear that what we have to be is prepared. And I know that's a difficult thing. I know we have lots of things going on, but I do believe that if we're going to do something that takes into account the current situations, and some of that may change by the 9th, just by what we'll learn and know about the results of this election, as well as some of the things that we're talking about, we need. I was talking with Mr. Driggs today. I've gone to a macroeconomics program for a bank that only does mortgages. And their outlook was very, very different than what we were having. So, but the real question that I have is, how do we do that so everybody reads and understands it? What works best for us as a group? Because it has to work for everyone to be able to read this and get it done. And then the other thing I think is that we're really good at having vision and having the ability to slide and move in and out of all of these discussions. And what I hear everyone saying is there's a commitment to making some model, as Ms. Watlington described, of prioritizing policy with cost, time, activities, accountability. And to do that requires a certain amount of discipline among all of us to do that and not to slide. So I think we're in a good place, and I think the conversation's going well. I do believe that this is the time that we need to hear from some of you that have not spoken, Ms. Anderson, Mr. Bakari, because I do believe that this is something we have to do as a group that commits. Mr. Mitchell, you have to weigh in on this because we're making big decisions on how we use our time and how do we create a successful city, and I think everybody's voice needs to be heard. So I'm going to start out with Ms. Anderson.
Thank you for the cold call, Madam Mayor.
You're welcome. I love doing that to you. You know that's what, I like to call you about 10 o'clock at night when you're supposed to be on the West Coast.
So I definitely provided some inputs in both of my committee meetings about the inner workings of the summit. However, what I would add is I truly believe that the power of this opportunity is for us to come together and to actually focus on one or two boulders, if you will, right? With a desired outcome as we walk into that. And I believe we need to have a book, a primer, similar to our zoning books, that we're required to read, and it's a litany of outside perspectives and voices from macroeconomic outlooks to partners in the community and their outlooks, as well as any other inputs that you would like us to have, city manager. And we come in and we literally work together and have breakout sessions on a couple of areas, right, and where we come back. But I view this as an opportunity to harness the power of circling the wagons. But in order to do that, we have to be prepared. We have to have all the inputs of the voices up front and absorb, so that baselines every single council member on what the current state is.
Mr. Bakari? Oh, I'm sorry.
Madam Mayor, I just wanted to note, we haven't heard from the other committees about their conversations, and this has been a kind of wide-ranging discussion, so I wonder if we should get that input. Just a
Well, I
suggestion.
was hoping that at the end of tonight, and maybe let me just do a check-in with everybody. I was hoping at the end of this meeting, we would make a decision about this jobs, because every committee discussed it. So I think you're pulling me back to say, okay, we heard from economic development, we heard from budget and intergovernmental, but we did not hear from the other committees on their discussions around this effort. So that's what we're saying? All right, then you want to go first, Mr. Driggs? With transportation, or do you want to, Mr. Bakari?
All right.
We'll come back to Mr. Bakari and Mr. Mitchell. They'll just have more advantage of information.
So should I talk now just about our housing and jobs conversation or about the whole committee meeting?
I would like for us to talk about the housing and jobs situation, because I think we're in a place that we could probably work through this.
I'm speaking for the Transportation Planning and Development Committee. The members of that are myself as chair, Dante Anderson as vice chair, and committee members Graham, Johnson, and Mitchell as members. We worked from a framework that was kind of suggested to us and considered, for one, equitable transit-oriented development. What are the opportunities for partnerships and coalition building? And I think looking at that, recognizing that the partners that we're talking about are probably private investors, and what we're really looking at is how can we leverage our own activity and investment through partnerships with people that have a lot more money than we do. And some of the things we talked about there were basically bonus provisions. So are we doing enough in our ordinances and with our spending to create attractive investment opportunities for private investors that might include like 10% of affordable, or that we have been told that dealing with the city is very expensive. So should we consider fast tracking and giving other advantages to private investors who are willing to help us achieve housing goals? We then talked about housing location and transportation. How can we ensure affordable housing aligns with high-frequency transit, bus, and rail? I think the couple of us, I believe, talked about buying land and land banking so as not to have the same experience we did with the Blue Line, one of the chief goals of which was to create that connection, and which ended up being a place that all of the people, the millennials, and a lot of people with very high incomes wanted to live. So what do you do about that? And right now it's expensive to think about buying land, but if we don't somehow shelter some land and control it, the market is going to do what the market is going to do, and it's not going to do what we want. So that was something we talked about there. Also, the inventory of city-owned land. We've had some conversations about that. What land does the city hold, and should it be available for development for housing? And of course, we have one example of that in my district where we bought some land for a police station and realized that there was enough left over so that we are now working on an affordable housing development in District 7. And then what opportunities does the city have to influence locations of public facilities, including schools, libraries, parks? I don't think we talked a lot about that. That has to do more with our relationships with other governments who actually control those things, right, at CMS and the county. The last piece in our outline was displacement and gentrification. What partnerships can assist addressing this issue as we further refine designs for the Silver Line? Are there new tools we need to consider? The one thing that I think stands out there is that this is actively being discussed in NEST, and therefore, I don't think we ought to get at cross purposes with our NEST process in trying to answer those questions. But we did talk about, again, the ownership idea, NOAA's, and working with small investors. I think Ms. Johnson brought up the idea of looking at landlords who may be small businesses or owners and might be willing to partner with us in a NOAA type of structure, developing a model that would allow that to happen. Otherwise, I think it is probably going to be mainly a question of working with our NEST committee and taking into account what they offered us. We had a question, should the city consider packaging affordable housing and transit funding like Austin? And I don't believe we discussed that much, Mr. Graham. I think that, personally think that's a difficult one because the size of our transportation needs is so great that if we then tried to tack on, goals that we had, significant goals that we had for affordable housing, we would be even more astronomical. So I guess that's something we can continue to talk about. Again, we didn't offer a conclusion from our conversation this morning. And then what additional support should the city put in place to mitigate housing relocation and small business impacts? Well, I think part of that is what we just talked about. You buy land and you facilitate investment, private investment, by favoring people who want to make those investments that align with our policies. And committee members, I don't know if I left anything out, but please speak.
Anything else from this committee on the, and we'll come back to you on the transit portion of it, because I know you spent a great
Right.
deal of time
Okay, thank you.
talking about that one. All right. So who else have we not covered? We've covered housing. Miss Watlington, there you are. Miss Watlington.
Thank you. So we covered two things, the Housing Summit and developer fees, which obviously ties into some of this conversation around affordable housing. And Sean took copious notes, so I'm sure that he's got the bulk of our conversation captured. But I did want to call out a few of the items specifically from this slide that we all worked from that had the 12 potential policy, well, in our case, 12 potential policy items. Each committee had potential topics relevant to the Housing and Job Summit divided by the comp plan goal. And in the Housing Safety and Community Committee, some of the ones that rose to the top that seemed to have the majority of interest in speaking about specifically were access to home ownership opportunities, neighborhood strategies to mitigate housing impacts associated with the growth of corporate landlords, job training and workforce support services focused on underserved areas and historically disadvantaged populations, and job growth in areas lacking access to employment opportunities. So certainly there was interest across the board, but those were the ones I believe in. Committee members, if there was another that I missed, please let me know. But those were the ones that the majority of the committee members wanted to discuss. Land strategies to expand affordable housing. Those were the ones that floated to the top in terms of priority to really get some policy around. As mentioned before, as it relates to the summit, we want actionable, we want specific, and as much as we can rally around a case study, we'd love to do that. We certainly would like to have our partners in the room that can contribute to a policy discussion. Also, though, where possible, if there is an element of public-facing activity that we could do, that would certainly be something that sounded like a number of committee members were open to in terms of workshops or job fairs or things of that nature to help educate our constituents, for instance, for people who are selling their homes, providing that financial literacy piece. If there's an opportunity to do that there, connect people to resources. If there's some, even if it was, and I'm just making this up as I'm talking, even if there was some rotunda type area where the summit was going on and members of the public could come in and get those similar type services, it wouldn't necessarily be something that the policymakers are involved in, but if all of those partners are there and they're able to have a resource at a table or so, certainly to the extent that we could double up, that'd be great. But that was something that came up during the meeting. those were the big pieces from the Housing and Summit. But if there's anybody else on the committee that wanted to speak to something in particular, certainly.
Ms. Johnson?
I was just going to add, Councilmember Driggs mentioned the NEST committee, and that's one of the things that we said in our committee. If we could get pre-reads or updates from those committees, from the NEST committees, from the other displacement committees, then we would have that material, to review and not duplicate our efforts. Thanks.
I also want to add, I think that your idea of having the public-facing portion of it, and I've seen this program that allows people to actually log on to some of those financial literacy programs, that if this is virtual for our community, that you could actually embed, click on this link to go there, and that really has been workable. I've talked to the manager about this, that this one guy that I knew, he does this for his employees because he wants to make sure that they're financial literate. And there are programs out there, but we could somehow embed some links to have people say, if you're having a problem, here's who you can contact. I just think we can get creative on that.
Like in the lower third, you mean?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mr. Bakari, did you have any comments?
Well, I think it's important for us to go into a session like this with our eyes wide open as it relates to what can and can't be achieved. And I say this thinking of the last month where we haven't been able to approve a calendar, and we haven't been able to go forth with meaningful portfolios of real estate bids and transactions because we just can't figure out how to work through them. So that's pretty material when you talk about us spending 2 days hopeful that we're going to be able to do so. A lot of preparation went into those things. So with that, I just don't see any way, unless there is an incredible amount of structure offline put into this. And here's how I'd do it if I was doing it. I would say everyone who has an idea, bring it forward, write it down in this structured manner, and it needs to be needle moving. So we're not looking to gather hundreds of little things that are places to spend money or little things we can do. There will be time to do that in the upcoming budget cycle. We're looking to identify at least one needle moving topic that's policy based. And then offline, every council member that has one, great. If you don't, not a problem. You bring it forth to staff, and it operates just like Congress has an Office of Budget Management, where they say, okay, walk me through your idea, and then they give it a grade and put it out for the rest of us. And that grade deals with, can it work for one property, one piece of land? Can it scale? Does it work across the board? What are the budgetary implications of it? And whatever it is, that comes forward, and we sit, whether it's an afternoon, a day, or 2 days, and we go through all of those policy ideas and decisions that have made that cut, and literally the person justifies and talks through at a micro level, okay, imagine a 3-acre plot of land where someone's coming with a NOAA proposition to us, and we would do this, this, this. Here's how it would work in one site. Here's how it could scale and wouldn't break the entire bank. And you make the case, and we basically, as a council, do like we do in the budget cycle, where it's a straw vote. And are there 6 votes enough that then staff can go take that and say, that's a big idea and a takeaway? And literally, if you're not part of that cycle, we love soapboxing. That isn't the time for that. This is about specific ideas. And again, like, just to level set, this is hard stuff. I mean, I have specific ideas in my mind, but I would have to really work hard in order to make my idea fit into that cycle. And things that couldn't work are $50 million for affordable housing in a bond the way we do it now, because it doesn't move the needle. Literally, like, it needs to have some kind of percentage of impact to the overall number of units in the crisis or the number of people below the poverty lines at AMI. So that wouldn't work. The idea we heard in housing today wouldn't work, even though it was a great idea, and I want to applaud them for thinking outside of the box, putting $1.5 million in ARPA towards reducing impact developer fees for affordable units would make 2 to 3, maybe 4 projects total, right? What would move the needle would be, let's get rid of 70, 80% of all developer fees, right? But then, all right, so that's a big statement. How do you go about doing that? Because then, whether, that is literally probably hundreds of millions of dollars a year that is passed directly on to the end consumer. So, but, I mean, the point is, if we're going to do little tiny ideas, then let's not waste everyone's time with 2 full days. If we're going to really get to work and make this important, where's that intersection? And I think the other thing is, it needs to be about existing tools and existing objectives in the comp plan and one piece of land, and then does it scale? And what I mean by that is, all right, so can we take existing tools that are in the higher plan, existing land use plans that we have right now, existing fee structures, existing pools of money, and I can do this, tweak them, combine them, add something here, and make this outcome happen. Because we've got a lot of tools that people aren't aware of or don't realize is a starting point, and I think that's where we need to make the policy decisions. So, like I said, I mean, that's a huge lift that I just described. I don't know how everyone does this. And I know I could personally do it if I dedicated myself to that for the time we have until then. But like, that's the body of work that doing something that moves the needle it looks like. So, hope that's helpful.
Very, thank you. Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you, Mayor, and you're right. Sitting around and listening to all the input from the brilliant brains around here doesn't allow me to say a lot. So I'm going to keep mine very brief. But I think we should think in terms of, let's look at this backwards, meaning, number one, what are our expectations? And so to me, if we can agree on that, then I think we work backwards, meaning then we set the date, and then based on our expectations, then we talk about who we're going to invite to get to our expectation. I do think this is an important conversation that we need to have public engagement. And so I would just say to us, if we want the public, the neighborhood, and the regular citizens to be involved, let's make sure the hours can accommodate them. I think sometimes we'll set stuff at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. when 80% of our citizens cannot participate. And so to me, we need to look at that latter part, that 4 to 6 or 4 to 7. I like Councilmember Anderson's comment about pre-read, or Councilmember Watlington. I think this is a heavy lift. I think we're all committed, but it's some material we really have to pre-read in order to be successful. Then, Mayor, I'm going to take you back to one thing we did, and I hope we can incorporate it. When you was at the Lee Institute, we had this big meeting, you know where I'm going, we had the big meeting at the expo, and it was very interaction. We used this online tool device, and we had the citizens to engage. What were they looking for? I think we was doing a branding exercise, Mayor.
It was after 9/11, and it was about what were the community's priorities.
And so I
think there were 1,000 people in the room.
Exactly. And so I don't want us to be intimidated by who we invite, because if we manage correctly, we could get still to desired results we want. But that public engagement was very key. And we had a device, very quick. The mayor had us, then she was wearing her Lee Institute hat, though. But it was great response from our citizens to say, thank you for allowing us to be there, and more important, have a say-so in the direction the city was moving. So thank you, Mayor. Those are some ideas I would just like for us to consider.
Okay. Ms. Watlington?
Thank you. Just building off of some of the comments that have been made in the room, I want to double down on this, what I'm calling a pitch competition. This space, I hope it's like a good one.
Did you say a pitch competition?
I said a pitch competition.
That's what I thought you said. That's what I thought you said.
And I think about, there is a program, and I don't know if it still exists or not, in which city employees can pitch their best ideas, and the ones that actually move the needle, there's an incentive associated with it. At least there used to be a program. I don't know if there still is. I would love to see how we could create an opportunity in this summit to be venture capitalist, if you will. Whoever you are, nonprofit, grassroots organization, you go do the legwork. You tell us what the impact is going to be. You tell us if it's scalable, X, Y, Z, and we can, I don't want to say judge, but we can choose the ones that feel like they've got the most merit. I think that opens it up to the community in a way that's equal access. I think that we could, from a pre-read standpoint, even for the community, to the extent that our staff and our partners can be available to provide some of this information to folks so that they can build their portfolio, I don't want to say portfolio, they'll build their proposals. I would love to see us do something like that. We just put out a bid. Look, we got $39 million. You want it, tell us why. And I think that if we open it up to not only our local community, but across the country to, like I know I keep saying think tanks or other institutions that get paid to do these kinds of things, bring us your best, we will fund it. I think that that creates a situation where we don't have to do all the thinking. Does that make sense?
Kinda, sorta.
Can I be Mark Cuban in that?
Did you say more Cuban?
I'll be Mark.
Oh, Mark Cuban. I was like, what?
So let me pose this question to you, as I've heard you talk about this. You know, we really understand how important public-facing engagement is. I mean, all of us have talked about the value of that. But I wonder if we are ready to do that, because I'm not so sure that we have had the kind of discussions among ourselves that we could do something. So I'm going to use Mr. Mitchell's long time ago example, but there was probably 8 months of work to get 1,000 people in a room that they could all vote electronically to do this. And it had a very specific presentation structure. So I think that, as Mr. Bakari says, structure for these kinds of discussions are very, very important. So if the structure has to work for us first, because we are the ambassadors to this community for what they want us to understand and help create. So I just want you to think and think about this, is that are we, as a collective, ready to say to the public, this is what we will do and can do? It's just a thought, just the question I would have for you to think about how this works. And then Mr. Jones, and we'll try to stop this in a couple of minutes and ask the question if there is enough discussion or is it too much discussion?
So I'll dip my other foot into the water. So Julia Martin just reminded me, because Julia and Donata, before she left, they were working on this, is that the structure, and I'll just put it out, and again, it's up to you, was day one would be more community focused. You would get input from the community, but day two is just you. So as you start to think about it, that was the last thing that we threw against the wall, was that get the input, but then spend some time as a council working through it. But that's all I have.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
I think, Mr. Jones, I think if you and staff go back and listen to this conversation that we just had, I think you'll be able to kind of draw what the intention of council is. And I think if you kind of footnote that with the conversations that we had in committee today, I think you'll find some pretty clear direction. But it's going to be hard for us, I think, right now at this point to parse it out, because we've all said a lot. We've all said a lot of similar things. There was a mention of technology. I think you were saying voting. I would say in today's age, it would not take 8 months, right? If we utilize technology, this is something that we didn't, I wish we did a better job through the pandemic of figuring out how to utilize technology to have big meetings that has public input, where we can kind of get real-time feedback. There are so many different virtual convention type of softwares out there. I've been meeting with groups over the past few weeks, whether it be from the Business Alliance, from the clergy, from just the community. Folks have been paying attention to this and are asking about when is this going to happen, and how do we input ourselves into this. So I think, again, you go back to this conversation, you'll find a direction if you can put together an agenda. And then, like you said, test it. What is the layout? How do we best utilize technology so that council is able to have an interactive summit with our community as a whole? And I think when you look at the plans that we're dealing with, whether it's the COMP 2040 plan, UDO implementation, Connect Beyond, we have a lot of our unhoused population, those master plans that we have as a community and as a council. We've been having the conversations. Now it's how do we synthesize it, and that's really I feel like this conversation started last council, and we just kind of need to push through it. I don't know if you can do it by the holidays. But I definitely wouldn't put it very further past January. But I think that's going to be the challenge. How do we do it well,
So I certainly didn't want to say that technology was the reason it took a lot of time. It was the pre-reads and the information and the figuring out, the different parts of this community, because Mr. Graham had a citywide Black agenda meeting that fed into the 1,000-person meeting, and there were the Jewish community meetings and all of this. So it was actually leading to, technology is probably the least of our issues. It's having
how you
those
utilize
voices and how-
technology.
I know, but it's structuring the questions so that they're consistent, so that you get the kind of reliability in your studies and the work that you're doing.
And that's what I'm saying. I think if you go back to this conversation, I think you'll be able to pull some clear questions out of it from the council.
Okay. All right, so we're ready to go to committees for the remainder of those reports. So why don't we start with transportation, Mr. Driggs? So you had the most colorful handouts.
Yeah, our slides are better than everybody else's. So I'll just repeat, the Transportation Planning and Development Committee consists of myself as chair, Dante Anderson, vice chair, Mr. Graham, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Mitchell as committee members, council members. The other two items on our agenda today were the Charlotte Transportation Center. And the main news, I think, was that we received feedback from the staff on their outreach and public feedback process. So they got a lot of data from talking to riders and other people, and reported to us on their assessment of the options that we're still talking about based on that feedback. And they provided us with rankings and a couple of slides that showed how we would prioritize. And basically, the feedback we got, to summarize, was that the option of not doing the P3, a new Charlotte Transportation Center at the same site, was probably not viable. It was a $50 million type of proposition, and we would not get the federal grant for it. So that was regarded as being one that we should not consider. But then also, as we looked at the three P3 alternatives, which were basically a concourse below grade choice, the at grade, and a terrace, which is above grade option, the recommendation we got from staff was that the at grade solution was probably not worth pursuing, that the terrace solution probably required some more work, and that the concourse solution is one that we should continue to work on. So a council needs to think about that, right? That's a recommendation from staff, and there are some pros and cons there. We were also given, in this context, some financial information related to not the at grade, but the other two options, indicating what the total cost was, which was estimated currently, based on information that we have now, at about $89 million. and that would be funded through a mixture of, for one, realizing the value of the land that the current bus facility is on, a federal raise grant, some money from COPS and CIP, a TIG, and then CAT's own budget. So there, we need to think about accessing those general fund sources of funding for a project like this, and in the context of, you know, what the alternatives might be. But that's what's being talked about right now. In the committee discussion, I think safety was one that was probably top of mind for a lot of people, and has been in the media coverage and so on, also discussed. Mr. Lewis talked about the idea of having a ticket-controlled environment where people could not get into the facility if they didn't have tickets. I think we'll need to study that more closely, would be my personal observation, because it's not hard to get a ticket, let's face it. And so how do we ensure that people who have tickets actually get on buses, or, you know, how does that work in greater detail? I think we're all sensitive to the Denver comparison, and we probably need more data on what has worked in other cities in order to reach a good judgment about that. The Center City, the aspect of this that we also need to think about is the idea that this will be a centerpiece for a district development. So as we think about whether or not to spend general fund money and so on, we do need to look at it from an economic development perspective, as well as just the issue of the buses. But questions have been raised about whether a center like this is still necessary when you have what looks like pretty radical changes going on with the use of buses and the ridership on buses. The facility that's being offered, as I know from an earlier conversation, is much smaller in a sense than the one we have now. There are fewer bays, reflecting a decentralization that is part of the plan that we have right now, Envision My Ride. So that's the update. I think the main news, which I believe the whole council will hear in more detail, was that we did get that community feedback, and it gave us a basis for trying to identify how to prioritize among those three. The last thing that we talked about was the Silver Line alignment. And what has happened here is that well, first of all, there was a small change in the alignment around Bojangles. And we saw a picture of that. It's not dramatic. It doesn't really relocate stations or change that area that much. It involves a higher bridge, maybe some impact on cost. But I think the consensus on the committee was that we were probably okay with that was, they should continue to work on that. The more difficult conversation was around Center City, where the line, the locally preferred alternative that we have been working with goes uptown all the way around and then comes down into Gateway. And as a result of a ULI study, we are now wondering if maybe the way to do it was to come down Trade Street and overlap with the Gold Line and then come into the Gateway that way. And there's a third alternative which basically comes across and has a different route. So we've got three options in front of us. It's kind of late to be changing that alignment because we have come quite a long ways on the assumption that that was going to be the alignment. But at the same time, we will need to get that right. So there was no conclusion in our committee meeting today. It was basically informational about these three options that are being looked at. And I think that we will need to do more study to decide which one is in our best interest. Ms. Anderson, you're looking as if you have a comment. Okay, good.
No.
I was afraid there's something on your piece of paper that I missed.
Well, Mr. Chair.
So, Madam Mayor, I think that's the gist of it, if anybody would like to comment.
So,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, and the latest one that were presented to us was the Mohead extension. You want to?
Oh, yes, yeah. Which, actually, if you'd like to talk about that, because I saw that, was not familiar with it, and so I don't know that much about it. There was a Moorhead extension proposal that I think we need to wait and hear more about that. I'm not sure what's going on, but you're right, that was the last piece. All this stuff is still very much in process, I guess is the simplest way to put it, so we've got some more work to do.
I do want to say that the MTC has also had this review, and it's still on their agenda as well. So there'll be weigh-in by both the council and MTC, Metropolitan Transportation Commission. All right, Ms. Ajmira.
So I'll review all of these three options. I'm not familiar with the other two alignment, and I might have questions afterwards. But did we look at the cost for each one of the Silver Line alignment option? Or is that too early?
We haven't heard details about the cost. There was a suggestion, from what I heard, that the Trade Street alignment would cost less because there is overlap with the Gold Line. They can share some of that rail. I will also mention that one thing about the locally preferred alignment is those two stations don't join up properly, right? So you have to walk a block to get from the Silver Line to the Blue Line. And that, to me, in the locally preferred alternative is an issue. But we don't have numbers.
So this was just informational. The committee is not making any recommendations at this point.
No, I mean, we're talking about all of this in the context of TMN, the sales tax, and those larger numbers that we heard about before, but we didn't get any detailed comparisons or updates on the numbers that we've seen.
Okay. And regarding the CTC, I just looked at the presentation, and I didn't see the numbers, but I know you did mention numbers in your presentation. So you said, what was the number for the option concourse, and then terrace option, and then street level?
So the slides that we saw said that the, only indicated that the transportation center at the same site without the P3 and without the tower would be a $45 to $55 million project, would not qualify for the federal fundings, and would not realize the land value, right? So you had a financial incentive to cooperate with a partner and realize the value of the land, qualify for the federal grant. And we were told 89 million, and I'm interpreting that to be the cost of the above-grade or below-grade option with relatively small differences. The at-grade option, I think I've been told might be $10 million less, if it's okay to say that. Does that sound all right? But that's why I said that as we go to finalize on this, we need to think, for one, about the efficiency of the bus system and how well it serves the air conditioning, the waiting rooms, all of those issues. But then we also need to think in terms of economic development about how we activate the area as a district. And I think as we get more information, we will be making a financial comparison. Again, the difference between the terrace and the concourse is not huge. It's not really a driver. The at-grade would be less, but there's a much bigger implication in terms of economic development and activation.
Right. I mean, we gotta consider economic development and some of these other criteria, but obviously the transportation should be our number one. But I look forward to reviewing that presentation in depth, and I might have questions for you, Mr. Drakes. I'll touch base with you later. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Mitchell, did you have a?
Just for all of us who wear glasses and our vision is not well, we're going to get 11 by 17 map because the committee members, we were struggling to see the alignment. So we request 11 by 17 city manager of the map, please.
I do know that in the MTC, there was discussion about the bridges, because bridges are very expensive to be built in an urban area like that. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes.
All those three alignments.
Okay.
We didn't get to have
Get a magnifying glass.
we didn't really get to have a good in-depth discussion about the routes for the Silver Line. One of all transportation investment, including transit, is economic development. And I think that's one of the things that I would like to us to consider when we're looking at those lines. What makes the most economic sense but not just from a cost standpoint. Interlining could make sense, but what both of the interlining options, what they restrict is economic development along the Grand Street route and north and west of the potential station. So as we're considering that, I don't know how we would model future kind of economic growth along that. I think that's gonna have to be something that we consider. And if we don't do that, the lack of economic development that, we're looking at over there, because I don't think there's another rail line that would be proposed anytime soon in that area. I think it would be great, to have more transit-oriented corridors. I think Trade Street we need to look at that prioritizes rail over vehicular traffic. Same along the Blue Line uptown. But I think, again, that would occur even without the interlining. That conversation should have occur without the interlining. We would not have the same economic development discussion without the original preferred.
Madam Mayor, if I could just comment on that. We did have an economic impact study done, if you recall, a few years ago, right, when we were looking at the original alignment. So maybe, and it looked at jobs, and maybe the idea is that we need to see something like that for the other alignments for comparison.
Okay. Wait, Ms. Johnson is recognized. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I was just going to ask, we did hear that there had been some public outreach, but if we could get a summary of what the comments are or how the public feels about it. I mean, we were told that there was some outreach, but we don't have any numbers, or I didn't get a sense of what the public preferred in today's presentation.
Okay.
So we need to make sure, I know there was a lot of concern about the, this was first proposed, about the structure of the CTC. So if we could get an update of how the public feels, I don't know if there's a website or what we're doing for outreach, but we'd like to hear from the public.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Ajmera?
Yes, I would also like to see some sort of ridership projections for each one of this alignment. I know it was done in the past, but do we have that for all three options?
For the,
Silver
for the
line.
Silver Line?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know the answer.
We haven't seen them in committee.
Okay, so I think that would be helpful along with cost estimates for each one of this.
Okay.
Just a quick point. I
McCarty.
think we should, wherever possible, minimize staff time and expense on things that we do not have a viable path forward on.
Okay. All right. So now we'll go to the housing group for the remainder of their report. Ms. Watlington?
I think I gave the majority of our report
Pretty much.
already. The only other thing I said was about the developer fees and taking a look at what that looks like to offer reimbursements. We cannot offer waivers or completely eliminate developer fees with the current framework. So we are trying to figure out how to incentivize what we'd like to see there, but definitely a great foundation to build upon. So a couple more tweaks, and I think we'll be ready to bring that back to the full council.
Okay. All right. Ms. Johnson?
Just for the record, it was reimbursements and not waivers.
Okay.
You hear me, Madam Chair?
Yeah.
Right, that's what I said.
Reimbursements, yeah, okay, all right, thanks, okay.
Okay, so I think that covers all of our committees. Oh, all right, thank you. Ms. Ajmera?
Yes, so. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I already gave a report on the Housing and Job Summit planning and the committee's recommendations on those. The other two items that our committee had discussed were the internal audit plan and the federal and state legislative updates. So on the internal audit plan, certainly the work that they do is very important from the transparency perspective and ensuring that our goals, implementation is being met with our council's goals. Currently, there are 10 audits in progress. I'm sure you probably have seen some of those reports, but all of those reports are available online. There are a number of audits that are scheduled for next year. So if there are, if you have any feedback on any of those audits and or potential scope change in the existing audit, let us know. But that was a great presentation by Tina Adams and her team. And the last item we had was the federal and state legislative update. As you know, we have an election tomorrow. There's a lot at stake here with tomorrow's election. And certainly that, depending on the results of tomorrow's elections, there will be priorities both in Congress and the State Assembly, and how there will be a focus on various issues and items over the coming months. So we did get an overview on those items for both Congress and the State Assembly. So our next step is to review the engagement strategy in collaboration with our regional partners and schedule visits to Raleigh along with our regional partners so that we are really representing as one voice there. So you'll see a schedule, a proposal in December from our committee, and hopefully we can schedule some of those visits beginning end of January to March, and some of you could sign up for those. So stay on the lookout for those. And that's all we have. Mr. Mitchell, who's our vice chair, anything else to add, or the committee members? Ms. Anderson?
Okay.
I would like to just make one additional point that we discussed in committee, and that is, it was shared with us that the administration will more than likely proceed pretty heavily with the CHIPS and Science Act. And I wanted us, and we discussed this in committee, but this is really potentially an opportunity for us to get out in front of some things as it relates to new clean tech manufacturing and the investment that the current administration is making in workforce development. And so there will be, as a part of this act, establishments of regional hubs. And it would be great if North Carolina could be, first on that list of regional hubs. And then what does that mean for the city of Charlotte and our greater region in general, as it relates to accessing those dollars for workforce development and standing up new tech manufacturing. So that's potential proactive work that we can do that would invest, time and energy in the next few months.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Anderson. And then we also did dive deeper into this bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed in 2021. And obviously, if Republicans do secure leadership in one or both chambers of Congress, then administration will refocus its efforts on the implementation of the work that was accomplished last year. And we did ask for a follow-up report on all the items that our region could benefit from out of bipartisan infrastructure law. So Mr. Fenton, along with our lobbying partners, will put together a list of items that potentially our region could tap into. And some of it's already, we have already sought some funds from this. So there'll be more to come on that one. Mr. Mitchell, you wanted to add something?
Councilmember Anderson just jogged my memory. There was kind of a conversation, committee chair, about the infrastructure bill you made reference to, but we asked staff to come back and give us a list of all the roads that are part of the infrastructure bill pertaining. Councilmember said she had issues in District 1. I know Ms. Watlington is getting beaten up by Highway 160, and so we just told staff if you can just give us a list of all those roads that the state is responsible for, that we get beat up on, so we can educate our citizens and more. Oh, we got W.T. Harris, yeah. Mallard Creek, yeah.
I had someone recently make the distinction for me for that, like state, responsibility versus ours. And they said anything that has a number is state. And everything that has a name, pretty much, in most cases, is us. And I know it sounds crazy, but I didn't know that before they said that to me.
Hey, listen, you learn a lot of things, and you make a great trivia partner at some point. That's it. That's what it'll be.
And on the state, there were a couple of items that I just wanted to highlight if you haven't had an opportunity to review our agenda. But really on the state side, there's a state budget, and then certainly there are fears of recession. And obviously, they will look at their reserves and see if they need to increase their reserves. But those fears also lie at all levels, including the local, and I think that's something we ought to look at the local level as well. And what is our reserves like, and if we need to increase that. We did look at the transportation at the state level. To Mr. Mitchell's point, some of the statewide transportation projects that are underway, we'll be getting a report on those. But I did ask Mr. Fenton to look at the Powell bill, and I think there was a total loss of $6 to $7 million last year. So how do we advocate for that, at least in next year's budget, along with our other transportation needs? So more to come on that later.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think that's all of our committee meetings. I would like to, if you would stay for just a brief closed session, just a minute. Mr. Baker, can you give me a motion for a closed session?
Certainly. I'd like a motion to go into closed session to
sorry.
consider the qualifications, competence, performance, character, fitness of an individual public officer or employee pursuant to GS 143-318-11A6.
Okay, all right. But I think, Mr. Mitchell, you had a comment before we go into closed session?
Yeah, just very quickly, I just think as soon as we get some dates when we might host the Housing and Jobs Summit will be great for all of us.
That would be great. I think that the manager recognizes how important that is.
Okay, thank you,
So,
Mayor.
and I think structure and timing is everything.
And also the infrastructure.
Yeah, we can do that one following this one, right? Is that a, yes, I think if
We
we,
talked, I don't know, as long as it's this year, we talked about ours in December.
well, it may not be this year because we were talking about January maybe for even this one, so it may not be because we still have to plan.
The council approved December, I believe, per the motion.
Said December?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll be doing, that's for Christmas Eve. Everybody bring their Santa Claus and outfits, their candy canes and trees. We'll be here. Okay. We have a motion on the floor for a closed session.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please raise your hands. Everybody that's here and those that left as well. This is really, really brief, but today.